Before I get into my talk, I'd like to first share a very brief animation for a vision of the future of patient experience.
This morning, Judy is reflecting on the past 12 months, how her love for painting began to fade. It's a year to the day since she was diagnosed with stage 2 Parkinson's disease. 6 months since her pre-op neural mapping began, adding her data to thousands of other patients to optimize her therapy. 12 weeks have passed since a small robot precisely implanted a micro implant which delivers stimulation and drugs. Judy still finds it hard to believe the procedure took only 2 hours and that she was back home that same night. Today is her 3-month checkup. Judy runs a weekly scan using her neurosensing device, then checks her neurological activity ahead of the telehealth consult. Dr. Green reviews her cloud-based patient diary via a connected dashboard using the NeuroInsight engine to compare her results with over 10,000 Parkinson patients' neurological maps. He introduces Judy to her virtual recovery coach, which uses brain-machine interface to provide feedback on activity and cognition. Later, Judy reflects on the consult. She is feeling positive about the months and years ahead, and for the first time in a long time, she starts thinking about booking a vacation.
That is a really compelling vision for what patient experience could be for a Parkinson's patient like Judy. And what I'd like to do today is talk through and imagine with you, what does the implant ecosystem of the future need to be in order to deliver that experience to someone like Judy? Imagining such an ecosystem, we can break that down into a few topics. First, what does that ecosystem look like? What are the fundamental technology building blocks required to put that ecosystem together? Who are the stakeholders that will build it? How would we even build it? And ultimately, what does such an ecosystem enable? And before I dive into this, please allow me to share the lens in which we are thinking about such ecosystems. I'm very fortunate to work with over 900 engineers, scientists, and designers at Cambridge Consultants, whose day job is to develop breakthrough technologies for a multitude of markets. And what is exciting is my colleagues are able to take technology, innovation, and insight and apply it from one problem in one industry to a completely different problem in another. And we're able to take a lot of that insight and channel that into medical devices, helping to develop next generation smart implants, robotics, visualization and navigation systems, critical care equipment, and digital surgery ecosystems. And today I'd like to share some of our learnings and insight and how we think about implant ecosystems. So let's get into it. So we're all familiar with the state-of-the-art implants such as neurostimulators that we've been able to deliver to patients today. We've come a long way as an industry. And we also already have a glimpse of what could be in Neurostem. We have seen the advent of micro implants that are leadless in cardiac rhythm management. So now let's extend this even further. We think the future of smart implants will be batteryless with actuation and sensing, will be wireless, and even shapeless, with the ability to deliver not just stimulation, but potentially drugs, even gene therapy. So let's consider such a micro implant, a stimulator, in the context of the care stream, from diagnosis and planning to the actual implant procedure to the patient's recovery journey. So if we have an implant that is a stimulator at heart, but also contains drug formulation, it needs to be precisely implanted in the right location, likely via surgical robot, which is using sensor-rich tools and optical techniques to validate the position and location of that implant, all while receiving real-time guidance that informs the surgeon and her team, which is backed by artificial intelligence and cloud-based analytics throughout the procedure in real time. And of course, Dr. Green is always in the loop to ensure a safe, effective, and high-performance procedure. But to make such a procedure happen, we're going to need to rely on a lot of inputs early in diagnosis. We can take neural mapping, multimodal sensing of Judy's disease progression, feed that into an AI-based planning engine, which is able to feed information and progression of disease back to Judy, and more importantly, help inform a cohesive therapy strategy that feeds into the real-time guidance of the procedure, helps titrate the right drug formulation, even select the right type of therapeutic stimulation from the microimplant, and again, keeps Dr. Green in the loop to have the best possible procedure. Now, if we fast forward post-operatively, Judy still has her implant, but now she's able to interact with it. She's able to monitor performance. She's able to potentially power it, interrogate it for data, and extract insights. And those insights can be shared through a recovery tracking system, which she can watch for her own sense of self, but also feeds into her virtual recovery coach, which has been pre-programmed by Dr. Green and the procedure engine to have the best optimal recovery path. Of course, that's constantly updating as her recovery gets better through a recovery engine. And she still has the network effect of working with her support group for emotional care. Now, this ecosystem starts to get really complex, and we can see that across different care episodes in the care stream, we're able to extract insight, but we need to stitch this together holistically. And that's where thinking about something like a global neuro insight engine becomes really valuable. We can pull data and insights at every step of the way over the year-long period to both inform Dr. Green and support him, but also to leverage a global consultation team, which can also use that data to inform the next patient's care. So this becomes really exciting, and there are clearly a number of technologies that would have to come together in such an ecosystem to pull this off. So let's take a closer look at what those technologies are. So in the diagnostic phase, many of us are familiar with head-worn EEG systems to be able to monitor brain activity and neural activity. What if we were to pair that sensing modality with other sensing modalities? For example, could we look to consumer audio as a platform? Can we be thinking about acoustics or embedding other sensing modalities into ear-worn devices to augment EEG signals? Could we pair those two signal modalities with smart textiles? For example, Myant is a Canadian company that has developed smart textiles that have interconnected sensing. They can sense pressure, temperature, humidity, chemicals, movement, and broadcast that information in a safe and secure way. Now, if we move from the pre-op and diagnosis phase into the actual procedure, we clearly come across robotic platforms. Now, surgical robotics is in its third wave of innovation. The first wave being, of course, Da Vinci-like systems. The second wave being a move towards smaller, more portable, modular bedside robotic systems, similar to the spine robot that we see here from BrainLab. But we're entering a third generation of robotics, where robotics are a platform for gathering insights, data, and being able to harness the power of the procedure to inform the next procedure. And we're able to do that if we compare surgical robotics with sensor-based tools. For example, there's significant academic literature using fluorescence, in this particular example, ICG, to help discriminate different tissue types or to understand perfusion. There are other optical modalities, whether it's Raman spectroscopy or near-infrared or Cherenkov luminescence. And there's a whole host of optical techniques that our industry can consider to help ensure precise location, characterization, even thinking about nerve health monitoring. Now, if we were to pair robotics and sensing tools with real-time guidance and an AI procedure engine, we have a very powerful platform to deliver a very strong procedure outcome. So for example, Metapixel is an early stage company in South Korea, which is using AI and advanced analytics to help auto-segment cardiovascular disease and help inform cardiologists the ideal placement for a stent. Now, if we move forward then into the recovery phase, so recovery coaches do exist. Companies like NeuroRehab VR are using virtual reality to tailor a patient's recovery regimen to their kinematic needs. And of course, we know of Peloton. They're not just a spin company anymore. They're due to release a virtual coach, which relies on a smart camera that can track body movement and give real-time feedback to make posture corrections. And if we look to the professional world, so leading football clubs, that's soccer for us Americans, are relying on technology from an Israeli company called Playermaker. And this is a boot-worn device that can track acceleration, deceleration, maximum kick velocity, ball touches for a single player, and coaches can actually track a cohort of their entire soccer team while they're playing on the pitch to be able to assess overall physiologic performance. What can we do as an implant industry to adopt such technologies to help understand a Parkinson's or MS patient's gait, balance disorders, movement, tremor? And then finally, thinking across the entire care stream, it might seem like a bit of a pipe dream to build a neuro insight engine that can truly amass all of this data and insight and really support the future of care. But companies are already doing this. So a Boston-based startup called Active Surgical is focusing their development efforts on a hardware agnostic AI platform that can gather procedure, clinical, and workflow data, and then inform surgeons on better techniques and potentially even automate parts of a procedure. And of course, there is a classic example if we look outside medical, where established insight engines, no pun intended, are already created. So GE Aircraft has been working for the past 6 or 7 years to create digital twins of all of their aircraft engines in the air. They currently have about 40,000 digital twins already. A single engine can generate a 0.5 terabyte of data as it travels over the Atlantic Ocean. Each engine has easily 2,000 parameters to monitor and track. And GE has built an entire insight engine to track all of their engines. And the value there is to predict performance, monitor performance, predict maintenance, but more interestingly, becomes a research platform to inform the next generation of engine development. So there's a multitude of enabling technologies available to us as an industry to build such an ecosystem. The bigger challenge is who will build it. So let's explore that. So if we have a complex ecosystem, it needs to be supported by invested stakeholders. And we have those invested stakeholders. So patients and clinicians are at the heart of really our industry and what we do, particularly when it comes to microimplants. And they work within hospital systems, physical therapy clinics, and engage with EMR systems. They also rely on deep innovation from device manufacturers, pharma and biotech, and even imaging companies. And of course, have allies, or sometimes not, in advocacy groups who are lobbying, regulators who are regulating, and see investment injection from payers and insurance companies, and certainly investors who are looking to unlock value from the entire ecosystem. Now, a large challenge for all of us is to understand, how do these partners work better together to create such an ecosystem? And we are doing that in pockets, but we can do better. One way we can do better is to think creatively about leveraging outside ecosystem partners who might be enablers or even disruptors. We have seen industry moves like Oracle with a pending acquisition of Cerner. Microsoft is working with large hospitals like Apollo in India to apply their Azure platforms to help look at 10 years worth of cardiovascular data and using AI analytics to determine better ways to inform clinical care. Or should we be thinking about patient experience the way Salesforce thinks about customer relationships? Should we be thinking about analytics the way Salesforce does? These will be interesting trends to see over the next 5 to 7 years, and what partnerships may arise in building such an ecosystem. So if we have the right technologies, whether they exist or can be developed, and we've got buy-in from the right partners, how do we go about building such an ecosystem? So let me share a playbook that we could think about. So in dealing with any complex system or ecosystem, it's critical that it is resilient to future uncertainty. And therefore, we need to think about scenario planning. And we can do that by thinking about actually looking inward. We are our best futurists in where we think industries will headed. We often hold strategic workshops to then work with key stakeholders and visionaries to think about the future state of technology and to map expectations of patients, market trends, procedure trends, and even thinking about new business and service models. And it's important to do this, to decompose it at every step of the way and think about what might a probable scenario be, but what might a disruptive scenario be, and ensure that that thought experiment then drives how we think about a system. And before we architect a system, it's also important to understand the unmet needs. We can use human factors engineering and insight to map a user journey through the episodes of care, to do stakeholder interviews, and to do observational research. And ultimately, scenario planning and needs understanding can feed into using systems engineering. Now, for those who are uninitiated, systems engineering is the discipline within engineering of bringing together complex multidisciplinary skills to deliver some really compelling high-value systems. And it's important to think about it not in the physical, as we often do as product developers, but actually abstract it to the functional. So on the right is just one example of what a functional architecture might look like for a microimplant. And it helps us think through trade-offs. So for example, does a microimplant need to have certain functionality, or can we actually push that physically to an external wearable to make the microimplant even smaller? Do we need a local AI engine at each episode of care, or can it be global with edge computing? So these are interesting trade-offs we can think through when we go through ecosystem development. And then finally, it's important when we have our North Star, or what that future ecosystem might be, to also backtrack and think about the short, mid, and long-term technology functions and investments that we need to make to fulfill that ecosystem. So we need to ask ourselves questions like, well, what technologies exist or can be developed, but also what are the white spaces that can be invented? And then where and when should we partner to fulfill that ecosystem? And the final point I'd like to make here is that most product companies in our industry are organized their R&D system, have organized their R&D teams for products. We are not organized to develop ecosystems. It's a different mode of thinking. It requires different talent and skill sets to augment the way we do R&D today. And that's an important area for organizations to keep their finger on the pulse, to shift as the industry shifts. So to close out, it's important that we reflect on what such an ecosystem can enable. So we have an ecosystem with rich insight, and that insight can really be empowering clinical teams to make, to help their day jobs, to help them make more informed choices, and to even be just a sounding board. We see an ecosystem enabling closed loop therapy, which is the ability for a single implant within a patient to have closed loop control within of itself. But we could even extend that further to where 1,000 patients can help inform the N+1 patient. A future implant ecosystem can enable new partnerships, new business and service models. It might even prompt us to think of new ways to measure healthcare value. 5 years ago, many of us would say it's all about the data. Well, it's no longer about the data. It's about the insights that we can extract from that data. Perhaps such an ecosystem can enable a next generation of clinical practice. It can disseminate new tools and techniques and insights into medical schools. It can help amplify the way we think about holistic patient care. But perhaps the single biggest reason to be embarking on developing such an ecosystem is to enable patients like Judy to have the best possible patient experience in the future.